Hey everybody, today is Monday, June 19th, 2023. Coming up on the show today, from The Flash, editor Jason Ballantine.
When Paul and I sat back on our 10-reel assembly at 4 hours and 20 minutes, then we thought, well, maybe it's time to start minimizing unless we're going immediately into Flash 2.
And editor Paul Machliss.
Stop, everyone open the doors. Let the cameras cool down, everyone take 15. And so it's the kind of thing that I thought, well, in 5 years, this is going to be an amazingly streamlined process. But I suppose you can't be the first to doing something without trial by error, really.
Yes, all of that and more on this edition of The Rough Cut. Well, greetings, post-production aficionados. Not to mention all you superhero fans that somehow managed to sniff out any content that has to do with DC or Marvel. Of course, I am glad you are here too. Who knows, maybe you'll learn that nobody knows more about movies and TV shows than the editors. And perhaps that'll keep you coming back to the show even when we're not talking about a DC or Marvel project. Just a thought. I have a lot of thoughts about today's guests, all good ones. Both gentlemen, to use that term generously, have been on the show before and on more than one occasion. Editor Jason Ballantine was on to talk about his work with The Flash director Andy Muschietti on It and It Chapter 2, not to mention working with director Anton Fuqua on the Netflix movie The Guilty. So check those two out if you haven't heard those. And then editor Paul Machliss, who many of you know from his work with Edgar Wright. He's been on the show before to talk about Cutting Wright's Baby Driver, for which he was nominated for an Oscar, as well as Last Night in Soho, yet another Edgar Wright movie. Both Jason and Paul were born and bred in Australia, but have never met prior to The Flash. Can you believe that? It is most likely due to the fact that they have both been working outside of Australia for the better part of their careers. Paul's been in England for the last 20 years, and Jason has been in LA for the last 10. So it would be the story of Barry Allen, aka The Flash, that would bring them together as co-editors finally, and ultimately today's guests for the show. We've got a lot to get into with them, as one would imagine. And don't worry, I won't leave you imagining for too much longer. We will get right into our little chat with them after a quick shout out to our good friends and sponsors, Extreme Music. For well over 20 years, Extreme Music has been providing content creators in the world of media and entertainment with amazing audio created by the top names in music production and composing. You got names like Trent Reznor, Michael Giacchino, Quincy Jones, Snoop Dogg, and so many more. All you got to do to get these great production audio tracks is to go visit their website, extrememusic.com. Once you're there, you can search their catalog on just about every aspect of music you can think of. You can even give them a reference track and say, hey, Extreme Music, find me something like this. And you know what? They will. That's just the kind of benevolent geniuses they are. On top of all that, their impressive catalog of tunes is customizable right down to the length and instrumentation so that you get the sound you want in a way that suits your story best. There's no cost to just give it a try, and as far as the licensing goes, you can take care of all that stuff online, or they can have one of their reps help guide you through it. So when you're ready to set out on your next media-making mission, be sure to visit extrememusic.com. Okay, feels like we've been waiting forever for this one. So glad the day has finally come. Without further ado, from The Flash, here are editors Jason Ballantine and Paul Machliss.
I'm sure Paul doesn't.
That Australian sense of humor in full effect. Okay, well, Jason, this is now your third film with Andy, having done the two It films with him. When did he approach you with this opportunity to do The Flash? And did you have any thoughts considering the film would be the biggest film for either of you in terms of scale and certainly audience anticipation?
Originally, the film was meant to start shooting prior to COVID, but, with that mess, it kind of put a couple of years pause on things. But yeah, I definitely wasn't out to qualify whether Andy's pursuits was something that I wanted to be involved with or not. If he jumps off a cliff, I'll follow him. It was obviously a huge amount of excitement that his filmmaking budgets and desires were growing film to film, but there was never a point where I was questioning whether I wanted to be a part of it.
And Paul, for you, this is, every time we talk, it seems like Edgar Wright's name is attached. This is not only your first outing with Andy, you were actually on location with him doing your patented on-set editing. So I'd love to know about meeting Andy and what he had to say to you about the film and what it was he wanted from you specifically.
I think I was one of a bunch of people he was going to speak to. Actually, the funny thing is I'd actually committed to doing another big film, and then sort of literally right at the end, the UK Post supervisor at Warner Brothers said, I think you should go and speak to Andy. Do you mind if I put your name forward? And I said, sure. Not thinking in a million years, that it was actually going to kind of happen. And so I knew very, very little about it. And I went to Warner's quite late one evening in December, just before Christmas, and Andy and Barbara and Michael Disco were there, and actually, Jason, you were there as well, I seem to recall, on the
Zoom.
On the Zoom. And I don't know, there was very little. I was given half a page of a blurb of what the story outline was, but I don't think it was about me being interested in the story outline. I think it was, almost like a chemistry check with everyone. And it seemed to, we seemed to hit it off, and we kind of talked about how it would work with Jason and myself and how that division would be. I mean, I mentioned something roughly at the time about on-set editing, which I think at the time he quite kind of quickly dismissed. And I left thinking, oh, well, that was good. And I know there were a couple of colleagues who were also up for it. And then suddenly I got the call, I think it was the next day, saying they're really keen. And so I thought, wow, all right. And then it was just a bit of negotiating to extricate myself out of the other gig, because after a bit of soul-searching, I actually felt like The Flash was going to be the better of the two. And then when I then very quickly did my Andy Muschietti research and just watched Mama and It 1 and 2 again, just to kind of get a grasp of things. And then suddenly I remember they said, we won't need you till about a week or two before we start shooting in April. Then, of course, the phone went early February saying, they'd love you to start early, just to start going through some of the animatics and previs and all that kind of stuff. So I found myself starting quite early, but it was good. And it was a nice way to get to kind of know Andy and then try and convince him that the on-set editing thing might be the way to go. And I seem to recall that, I even showed him the trolley and I said, this is it. And he said, yeah, and I said, well, look, let me do a couple of days for you, a week or something. If you really don't like it, I'll go scuttling back to the cutting room. And it only really took kind of 1 day or 2 days when he kind of saw the prospects of it and the capabilities and what it could mean for him and his directing and how it could benefit, that he just sort of said, yeah, no, I think let's go with it. And be careful for what you wish for then, because, of course, then it was the entire shoot, all the night shoots, day shoots and locations and things. But I think in the end, between Jason and myself, we worked out quite a good process for that assemble period or for the shoot period, I think.
I think it's interesting you mentioned going back and watching It chapters 1 and 2 and getting familiar with Andy's work, because Jason, this character of Barry Allen, the Flash, has already appeared in cameos or as part of an ensemble in previous DC films. In addition to that, and I'm no expert on comic book lore, but the Flash story that you guys told is also based in part on the comic book Flashpoint. Do you personally invest much time in watching or reading up on those things to prep for this? And does Andy do anything other than give you the script to get you acclimated to these characters and this storyline?
Yeah, I had a lot of learning to do. There were some assistants in the cutting room that were my greatest resource for a quick education on the correlation between Flash and previous moments. I'd watch the Snyder films just to feel like I could be as up-to-date as I could. Looking on my shelf now, I have references to the Flashpoint books and things like that, but I must say I looked at the pretty pictures and didn't get too much involved in reading the stories. I think that, like with most films, obviously there's a respect and a homage to be paid to those who have trodden before you, but then in another sense too, the film has to stand alone by itself, whether it's being true to the fans who come and obviously see the film, but also makes sense to those who have no idea what the hell's come before it and how does the film stand within itself. And I mean, obviously I'm respectful to the IP, but I wouldn't tout that I wore Flash T-shirts to work every day.
Well, nobody would fault you for that. Principal photography, I believe, took place from April to October 21 in the UK, which is where you were, Paul, using your now infamous on-set editing trolley, which we have chronicled on more than one occasion on this podcast, going back to Baby Driver and more recently Last Night in Soho. Mm-hmm. If I can twist your arm to recap that setup and how it's integrated into production, as well as how it may have evolved since we talked about it for Soho, I'd love to hear that.
Well, it was a laptop-based system, and I guess one of the biggest changes, I mean, apart from the fact that physically it was a lot more kind of portable than previous systems. And also, in the past, we kind of used like a Panavision cart, and then we just kind of put the kit on top, and so I had to kind of disassemble everything whenever we kind of traveled. This time it was a purpose-built stuff, so a purpose-built kit. So the monitors were kind of on armatures, and they could be closed down, and there was something where I could take the laptop off and put it in the drawer and hook it up. So you could very quickly rig and de-rig, and especially when you learn when you're on a film set, and they go, right, we're moving on, you need to be able to move like that, because the crew just goes whoosh, And there's no wait. I can't. There's no time for that. So it was really good having the convenience to be able to move around quickly. I suppose the biggest change was not so much the layout, because at the end of the day, it's still it's Media Composer, but it's the way I receive the information. And normally I would be connected via an Ethernet to the QTake system, and so I'd be hardwired. But it kind of meant where Video Assist was, I kind of had to be. And it was a suggestion actually from Tim Grover that I try the Moxion system, which is ostensibly a kind of like a Russia's monitoring system, whereas as soon as a take is done, say on quick take, and the operator stops recording, it immediately gets uploaded to a server and can be viewed by anyone, anywhere in the world, effectively, who's logged into that system. Usually for kind of execs, say maybe in LA, to watch what's going on in real time in London and things like that. But we realized that actually there was a thing with it which you could actually download the clips and use them as Avid Media. And so basically it meant that for the first time, as long as I had a Wi-Fi connection, which would be set up at whatever location we were on stage or outdoors, as long as I had access to that connection, I could be anywhere on set, either near Andy or away from Andy or wherever was convenient, and get the media. So it meant that I had the access in that way. And then it kind of, and then also what they did is that they wired up a kind of a BNC video return to Andy's monitor. So I could then basically play him stuff. So he didn't even need to come over to me. I could just sort of, switch over and tell the Video Assist chap to patch the output to his monitor. So basically he could then watch stuff on the go. And it was great because as well as Moxion was being used by basically every department. So the second unit up in Glasgow, the C camera unit, the pickup unit, everybody was connected to Moxion. And so it actually meant that you could get all the media in from every department all the time, and you could keep an eye on what was going on. With second unit, we actually had another editor up there who was helping out on the shoot in Scotland, and he would send me clips, which I could then send to Andy or integrate it to something that we'd done all previously, and then we'd send it back to our chap in Scotland and say, here, tomorrow when you're dropping in new shots, can you use this sequence? And so actually the back and forth went great. I mean, I'd never had that kind of flexibility before. And then basically we then used that other system that we'd done previously, that at the end of every day, I would download all the media and the projects and the bins onto a travel drive, which would then go to editorial and then would be uploaded. So Jason, who could probably pick up the story from this point, would get those days' assembles, and then Jason could do his own pass on the material as well.
So Jason, in addition to doing your own pass, you were also doing second unit, and you were doing something called splinter dailies or splinter unit dailies, which is, I think I told you before, is a term that I'm unfamiliar with. So in addition to that, what I'd like to know is for films of this nature, I talked earlier about how this is bigger in scope than something like even It, Chapter 1 and 2. Regardless, for a film like this, are you involved earlier on in pre-production more so than you would be on a more basic, for lack of a better word, comedy or drama? When you have these big visuals, does that require that you get involved earlier on? And then also, what are splinter dailies?
Well, splinter dailies is probably my own made-up unit. Or as Paul said, C camera or second unit. It was the derivative of main unit. There was a principal action unit, and then there were insert units along the way. But as far as previews, that's what Paul was talking about, that Paul was doing prior to main shoot. Going back to your other question regarding my familiarity of the film, DJ, our visual effects supervisor, brought a great security blanket to the style of the look of the film and his knowledge to what world we were dabbling in, because he was a part of Snyder's vision. And so that was great, and it would have been Paul's work with DJ in those early days for configuring sequences and things like that.
Well, being a multiverse movie, you're going to have multiple iterations of characters, which you certainly do here in The Flash. You have two Flashes, which at first blush, it sounds like, well, that's not something super complicated. That happens all the time where you have one actor playing two different characters in the same scene. Maybe it's an animat here or a split wipe there and a little digital face replacement. In fact, Paul, for Last Night in Soho, you had a similar challenge. You had an actor playing two characters in the same scene, often in highly choreographed situations. Last year, you teased that The Flash would be the first film to be utilizing some very, very new technology in terms of getting multiple versions of the same actor on the screen, rather than using locked-off cameras or even the motion control things you used in Soho. With the film out now, can you finally tell us about how you achieved having Ezra Miller as Barry Allen in the same scene twice, Because it happens throughout the film. They're both in the same scene.
Yes. Well, of course, I mean, on set, of course, it's still only physically possible to film one Ezra Miller at a time. So we had basically Ezra would play against Ed, who was more or less around the same kind of height and build, and wear the same costume, and they would literally do their scenes together as if Ed was the other character. So Ezra would have someone to kind of react to and all of that. Meanwhile, of course, Henry Brame, our DP, had invented this kind of rig, which we were shooting our red cameras with, which basically allowed him total freedom of movement. There was nothing which suggested of needed to be repeated moves or anything as sort of large and unwieldy as a kind of a motion control rig, basically. In fact, I don't even remember seeing a pair of sticks on this film at all. I don't think we did anything kind of locked off. So Henry had complete kind of 360-degree movement, and between him and Andy worked out how the shots should go. And then it was a process of recording that side of Ezra and then kind of editing those sequences together against Ed's dialogue, and then kind of deciding when you were going to cut to the other Ezra, when it was going to be either like as a two-shot or as a single, knowing that at some point, and in fact that point ended up being February of the following year. We actually shot it in two goes. I think February we did some, and then in the following June, which is when we actually got to shoot the other side for the first time. And actually that presented a lot of really interesting challenges, which I'm sure, Jason, feel free to agree or disagree. I think it proved some challenges that I don't think I'd ever come up against before in editing, because you're trying to think how Ezra, the other actor, would react. And sometimes Ed may not have said the line as fast as Ezra would have said the line. And there were points where I think we actually got, correct me if I'm wrong, we got Ezra to actually say some lines in terms of ADR. We actually got him to record the other side of his dialogue. So we had his lines to work with as a temp, but then Ed would be saying his lines. But then you'd have to try and think, okay, Ezra's saying this line and he might need to do this bit of physical movement at the same time as he's saying his line, because, he would need to gesture to something. Well, Ed might say it a bit faster or a bit slower than Ezra might, because Ezra's got his own internal rhythm. And sometimes you think, oh, okay, well, I need that shot of Ed, but I actually have to cut while Ed's still talking because Ezra would have said it by now. And so there was a lot of that kind of, okay, so if I ignore what Ed's doing and try and think about how Ezra would have done it, but then do I get the right part of Ed? So when Ezra says it's over there, for example, Ed gestures at the right time, you see, and you had to plan all that out before you could take it to the next level. And of course, it involved regular editing, Andy going through all the takes, choosing the correct performances for Ezra on that side. And then the demands of VFX to say, guys, we really need to turn these scenes over because otherwise we won't have them ready when we move into the volume capture, which is like part 2 of the shot. That was very odd, editing one side and not really seeing how the other side would turn out until literally months later in some cases.
Just to detail a little bit to what Paul was saying. So as Paul said, there was no motion control, there was no conventional locked off camera with a split screen. And this volume capture to obtain the B side, on the A side that Paul was describing, Ed, the physical stand-in, would have a rod sticking out of his back with a 360-degree camera literally above his head, and to the best of his ability, try and move with that encumbering thing over him. But the importance of that was it was effectively photographing what would become Ezra's eye line when the B-side was shot. And so Paul was on set in this small room, and the air conditioner had to be turned off frequently because of noise, etc., and it was a nightmare. But Ezra would stand in this cylinder, effectively, which had hundreds of cameras all record, well, hundreds or 72, Paul, I don't remember.
120, to be precise, actually, 120 cameras.
And those cameras weren't capturing picture as such, they were capturing data for a performance. And the benefit for Ezra doing the B-side is that he could see himself projected on the 360-degree screen. And so he could interact and obtain a rhythm of the coordination within himself, his own dialogue rhythms between the two characters. He also did that also for Dark Flash, the third character that he played. And so that was spitting out data, which then did actually generate a pretty simple picture for us, which we were then able to choose performances for. But it also, there were witness cameras shooting as well, which gave us a little bit more of a real-life picture representation of the B-side performance. It just wasn't shot from, or lit or wasn't shot with any composition consideration. And so, as Paul said, first pass was just best guess at the A side, which then Paul had to prepare for the capture booth, which included, Paul, was that right? You had to add a couple frames to each edit point?
Because then we realized that there was actually a 6-frame delay in between each camera cut, because we weren't actually doing one angle and then going cut and then an angle, because Jason and I had actually already pre-cut the sequences. So these sequences had to be fed into this cube. And of course, it was an LED, it was a 4-wall LED with these cameras all sort of hidden in between. And part of what would happen would be whenever the LED would generate a lighting map. So when Henry turned the camera and say the light direction changed, all the LEDs would reflect the actual lighting on set. So it means that Ezra in this booth would be lit correctly no matter what the camera did. If the light source was there and Henry kind of pivoted that way and the lighting changed and he got into a bit of shade, that's exactly what would happen inside the booth. But then what we realized is that in a cut sequence, there would be 3 frames where we'd have to extend the cut to allow the cut to happen, and then 3 frames before the lighting would catch up. So it would take 3 frames for the lighting to change into the right point. And so that meant having cut a sequence, we would actually then get Haley, who was one of our VFX editors, would then have to break into our edits, putting in 6-frame handles either side of every single cut. Because we had tons of conversations. Should we just do one setup at a time and make it easier? Should we do sequences that last 30 seconds, sequences that last 2 minutes? And we actually broke it all up. There were shots that we felt we could do it as a oneer, and then we could just play the whole thing out as a single thing. Then there was stuff that, this is too complicated. We've got to play the cut in, and we've got to react to all the angles in one go. And we said we'd much better for Ezra as an actor, just to kind of, for a feel thing, is just play the whole scene through, not one setup at a time. And also, we just wouldn't have had the time to do every single setup independently. And so they made, every day we had this huge list. The VFX department did a remarkable job, just basically getting a daily's list of, okay, today we're covering these scenes, these are the things we're doing in a oneer, these are the things we're doing as a sequence. And then, of course, as Jason pointed out, we had to stop the aircon because when we would record, the amount of heat generated by the lighting, also the amount of data generated by all these cameras. There was only so many terabytes we could actually record in a day, and we would be told you can't run the cameras for more than 3.5 minutes. And I just remember that, literally we were winding, we were kind of going, right, 30 seconds, 20 seconds, the first AD, and we'd have to stop. But of course, Andy would just keep running in and say, Ezra, okay, now try it like this, try it like this. Okay, we're going to have to stop recording in 20 seconds because the cameras would just overheat. Stop, everyone open the doors, let the cameras cool down, everyone take 15. And so it's the kind of thing that I thought, well, in 5 years, this is going to be an amazingly streamlined process. But I suppose you can't be the first to doing something without trial by error, really.
I guess. Well, speaking of cooling down, I think my brain just melted. Jason, I was so fortunate to come see you when you were working on the film at Warner Brothers. And when I got there, you said, just ask for baby shower, which was the code name for the film. At the time, I did not know what that was referencing. But having seen the film, now I know. The way the film kicks off, Batman lets Barry know, or Alfred lets Barry know he needs his help with a hospital that's crumbling. And babies are literally flying out the window. It's a pretty crazy scene where Barry is trying to rescue all of these flying babies. What did you have to work with to build that up from just scratch all the way up to the finished product that we saw on screen?
Well, like I said, I came in February because they said, they need to start getting an editor's look on this. So basically, in February, I'd realized they'd already been working on these sequences for about a year, and Andy would come in most evenings and watch what we do. We try and cut them all together so there'd be kind of a rhythm, and then Andy would suggest we should see this angle from here, we should see what's going on from this side. And we tried to put it together as best as we could. I don't think we ever totally completed the sequences, but we basically then kind of had something ready to kind of give to the shoot and have reference. And of course, it literally took over the course of the whole shoot to shoot that opening sequence, because we did it in fits and starts all the way from April through till October. So we finally had a thing where we had the previs, we had some stunt viz, and we could slowly kind of fill holes with actual footage. And like I said, it's this scene, I mean, it's a great scene, and it's principally Jason's baby, because I wasn't really doing a proper edit. I was kind of doing a proof of concept on set to make sure all the setups worked, and whatever we had that day, we'd hand over to Jason. And of course, because a lot of the shots weren't finished, I think, Jason, at the time, you then had the live action footage. We still had some remaining previs shots and whatever you had at that point when you kind of took over and did the full scene.
As Paul said, I think, the biggest thing with a film like this is your imagination needs to come in and rescue you at many times. And for a lot of the time, Ezra wasn't even wearing his suit because of its inflexibility. And he had this tracking marker suit on. But he was still physically bounding over blue screen blocks and had cabling rigs to help him fly, etc. So for the greatest time, the beginnings is really just match cut the action to him going from one setup to the next, because I got no idea what the hell he's jumping and what he's doing in this moment. So you just make it fluid. But then when Paul and I sat back on our 10-reel assembly at 4 hours and 20 minutes, then we thought, well, maybe it's time to start minimizing, unless we're going immediately into Flash 2. And so that's when, you start to articulate visual effects, as Paul said, starts to return shots. You get a better understanding of what the hell you're even looking at, an appreciation for scale. You read the action beats in the script, and as Paul said, sometimes there might be previs in moments, but the whole edit process is the flexibility of learning, being open and willing to change. And even when Paul and I were really hitting our stride in terms of we had a really nice feeling edit, we were still being requested to find time. And Paul and I had split the 10 reels into 5 each, which was principally just leapfrogging each other in the story. And we'd just make our own passes. Creativity requires ownership, and so we kind of kept to our own reels, and we would just make passes, and Paul would come in and tout, I just lost 35 seconds in blah, blah. And I'd think, shit, how'd you do that? Wow, that's awesome. And so, it was just this revising, whether it was through basic in-camera photography, and the simplicity of what that is, to the complexities of this multi-pass, multi-consideration and performance through volume capture.
I mean, it was interesting because actually when we got that assembled, and as Jason pointed out, he made reference to the duration, and you realize what was technically called the pre-title sequence was actually about the quarter of the length of the average of most feature films. You kind of think, and bless Andy. I mean, it's Andy's very much like, he wants the cake and to eat it too, and to start, thinking of Jason in particular. It was quite moments. We've really got to cut some stuff down. We've got to trim this sequence. It'll still work just as well if we take some time out, which actually is always very true. And it's amazing because, we would have screenings and the producers would come in and people would watch in the studio and say, oh, it's great. It's, any way we could take another kind of 5 minutes out of the film, and you go, oh gosh, we'd already done, what was the
Russian passes.
The Russian pass. And you think, well, how can I possibly get rid of, we'd already we kept the, pared to the bone, surely the scene's pared to the bone. But once you start going through the reels, even with the ones with just straight dialogue, and you say, well, actually, 2 frames here, 6 frames there. And before you knew it, Jason and I had actually possibly taken about another 8 or 9 minutes out of the film without kind of realizing how we took 8 or 9 minutes out of the film. But it was still the film. And it was great when, you could show Andy, what did you take out? I don't know, but it's 45 seconds short of that moment. And he'd just go, great, fantastic. So it was just things like that, as you say, the discipline of getting it down to time, of having the story make sense, and just realizing that there's a lot of stuff. There was a lot of embellishments during the shoot as well. 6-page scenes would mysteriously become 11-page scenes when you arrive in the morning because, there was a need to kind of expand a little bit. And especially the last act, I think, with Dark Flash, that was... That's what I refer to as our Kurtz in the compound scene, because that was a scene which originally just went on forever. And there was a lot of philosophizing from Dark Flash and of about the whole thing. And as exciting as it was, it just had to come down.
So we could talk about visuals for days, and I would like to. But just to make sure I get some of the music aspect in, I want to ask you about that. You know, the film opens with a needle drop, Chicago's If You Leave Me Now. And it's there at the start of the movie to set the mood for where Barry, the Flash, is in his life. He's feeling underappreciated and lonely and sorry for himself. Probably sorry he has to listen to that song. No disrespect to Chicago. Anyway, what is your process for doing the needle drops? Because you can take this multiverse concept to the extreme. Because I noticed later on in the film, you have another Chicago needle drop, the much more up-tempo 25 or 6-4. So it's almost like these two alternate universes where Chicago would be If You Leave Me Now in one, and then it's 25 or 6-4 in the other. Were you even aware of that Chicago multiverse aspect? And what is the overall process for choosing needle drops to support the story?
Well, so stepping back a little bit, Andy's attraction to Paul, because Andy did meet with other editors, is Paul's strength in the music side of editing, particularly Baby Driver. And Andy had said from the beginning that he'd like to have a few musical moments in the film. My interpretation of musical moments were a little bit different to what we ended up doing, because in the end we sort of just kind of did more like needle drops and cutting as opposed to the action being intrinsic. For me, a musical moment would be more like what Paul did on Baby Driver, where the shots are specifically constructed the timing of a music, whereas for us, we were kind of just trimming existing action to fit the beats of music, if you know what I mean. It wasn't, the photography wasn't necessarily choreographed to a preconceived needle drop. There are lots of experimentations, like Flash running into Gotham for the first time. You know, we tried multiple music there. There was, for a long time, the second Chicago song you're talking about had other cues in there. What was the one that stuck around for a long time?
My Sharona, I think.
Oh, no, prior to that.
Oh, the first one was the Kinks, wasn't it? It was the...
yeah.
Was it You Really Got Me?
Yeah, that's right.
Yeah, that's the one Andy said, you know, load this in and when you're on set and we're putting this sequence together, use that. And then we put it together, and even then I kind of said, yeah, I don't think it's long enough. It's not kind of sitting. But anyway, I mean, that was a discussion for another time, but it was, I mean, fun enough, that scene actually was probably out of everything, probably the most Baby Driver moment of the lot, actually, where we ended up specifically kind of landing things on downbeat, things like that. And I think for a long time, I mean, Andy's an amazing musician in his own right. Andy has a fantastic knowledge of music and songs, and he would constantly come up with ideas. Okay, well, if the Kinks don't work, why don't we do this? Why don't we do that? And then I think where we went was My Sharona in the end. And I'd spend a long time cutting that moment to My Sharona, and I think... And it worked. It worked a treat. And then when I did my portion of the film and I left to go back to London to start working on another show, and then in November, I remember they sent the sound mix to Warner's so we could have a review, and Andy said, oh, by the way, I've changed the track to Chicago. And for a minute, I just thought, oh, right. But then actually I realized I did a very clever thing, is they were looking for like a tempo map that kind of matched that thing. And then Jason actually did quite a fantastic job of making sure the Chicago track worked and it hit the same beats as My Sharona. And, you know, it's always very satisfying, especially when you do come from that background, that you do work a lot with music, and there's just something intrinsically satisfying about having things happen on beats. And so to have that work with either, you know, My Sharona or 25 or 6-4, you know, there's just something very enjoyable about watching that. And so that's where I think we got the double bubble on Chicago. I think that just came in at the last minute. There wasn't a kind of Chicago conspiracy.
Well, there is such a, as you just illustrated, such a chicken and egg aspect to music and films. And that's certainly an example, or a few examples of how it works with needle drops. For the score, Jason, again, this is your third film with Andy, also third film with composer Benjamin Wallfisch, because he worked on it as well. Something I don't think I've ever asked editors about is the spotting session aspect of it. So what is the process of working with Benjamin like for integrating his score into the film?
During the shoot, you know, Paul and I definitely had our, we were busy with the volume, not the volume capture, the volume of the material being shot. I think Paul's like average of 6 to 8 hours a day, if I remember right.
Oh, yeah.
And so we had the blessings of a music editor, Lise Richardson, who has worked with Ben previous. I mean, that's just heaven sent to be able to focus on your day job cutting picture and then have somebody with their musical knowledge and expertise come in and help support your assemblies with putting temp music. A lot of those early scoring references were from the Snyderverse, just because it had an appropriate feeling. And then, of course, with our 80s reference to Keaton suiting up, Danny Elfman's score was revised, and that sat in as our temporary placements. And so that roadmap, which Andy's very involved with, as the edit tightens, the music changes, the emotion of the scene changes, the temp score will change. But the effort that goes into a temp score, yes, it's thrown away on the final mix stage, but the education, the exploration, and the roadmap that it provides to the composer, Ben, is so valuable. And so Lisa put in, tremendous effort to make the sound feel good. The other thing too is, of course, for Paul and I, the best state the film is at the point, even playing to Andy, the better the sell is that the picture cut's okay. And, even just temp effects, sound effects or whatever, spot effects, it all assists. And for an audience screening, which of course, happens well prior to a composer mixing on the final stage, then again, you have to give that movie experience, and temp score is critical for that emotional support.
I have to say, I didn't notice too much as an audience member, a lot of Atmos treatment things happening. He hears his mother's voice giving him some advice, and it comes over the top of the audience. It really grabs you because I feel like you didn't overuse that element or aspect of filmmaking previously. I could be way off. Suffice to say, I'd like to know your approach to surround sound and just being conscious of sometimes less is more. And in the key moments, because I've laid off a little bit, I can have a greater impact.
I mean, less certainly can be more. I mean, in terms of the Atmos mix for this film, I will have to defer to Jason, actually, because he and Andy were there for the final mix. I was already back in the UK at that point. So I was there for the kind of the temp mixes. And like I said, they were very kind to share with me the mix in kind of November. But even then, I was only listening to a 7-1. So I'm going to be honest, I don't think I've actually heard the final Atmos mix yet.
That particular moment, Paul, that Matt's talking about was your creative concept, though. That was the flashback of in Mum in the kitchen with the little tear in the wall that matches to her mouth.
Oh, that bit. Sorry. Yes. Well, that was interesting, that moment, just because Andy kind of loosely described there was going to be a flashback where Barry remembers what his mum said when Barry was a kid, and we talked about how to do that, and it was going to be when he was working on his math problem and he could never kind of get the math right, and we just kind of thought, and Andy said, well, what it really should be is it's like, he tears the paper in frustration as a kind of a 6 or 7 year old, and then that in itself, in terms of his flashback, actually allows concurrently there is a tear in the fabric of the chronobol as well. And I just remember being a little bit creative. Actually, I remember saying to the team in editorial, I remember specifically speaking to Esther, who was our first assistant editor, can we just grab a camera and an iPhone or something and literally let's just get down on the floor and let's just start drawing some stuff and just doing tears. Let's see what happens, and literally the guys just sat on the floor in the corridor of the cutting room and said, let's just shoot just get a pencil and just tear it so hard, just put so much pressure on it. And they had a ball because they actually, we literally just had a little shoot in the corner of the corridor to try and get that concept there so we could kind of drop it in, because usually the best way, and this is in terms of what Jason was referring to about sound design, it's almost like, well, if you want to show people what you mean, you should just go ahead and do it, and try and do it the best way possible and do it yourself, because that's the best way you can make people understand. And so we did this little thing, and then Andy and I kind of worked out how you could incorporate Mum's line coming through. And it was just, actually at that point, it was just using what footage we kind of had available and just kind of mucking it up, and just in a kind of a moment of creativity, working out what the best way to sell that point was. And I think it's also just about dynamic shaping as well of things. And I know I'm guilty of oft quoting this phrase from Phil Spector, much maligned as he is these days. He actually very correctly observed that, especially in his wall of sound, some sounds shouldn't be heard, but they should be felt. And I think that's a really, really important, that kind of really struck a chord. And I think certainly in a mix, you can make sounds felt but not heard. And I think actually with the chronobol, and with the placement of the mum's voice, with the placement of the tearing of the pencil on the paper, and then you'll have Ben's score and everything else, And especially in an Atmos environment, to be able to kind of place objects and to have them dynamically interact with each other, but each kind of occupying their own little space, I think it's one of my favorite parts, actually, of the post-process. So I knew it was all in incredibly good hands, and it did sound amazing at the end of the day, but I think that was what the purpose was of that scene.
Jason, as much as you know I love seeing your name in the credits, I love it even more when the editors are actually in the film. There's all kinds of Easter eggs for this film because it's a superhero movie. Of course, it's going to have a million Easter eggs, and we won't get into all of the ones that the fans are going to have fun with, but the editing fans, give me a couple of Easter eggs for those of us that just love seeing editors actually in the film.
Well, there was a perfectly cast mad scientist. So if you are watching the moment where Supergirl says that she will come to aid the two Barrys in fighting Zod, if you have a keen eye for a picture-in-picture on the screens behind, you'll see Paul and DJ, our visual effects supervisor. And then there was a moment with Andy figuring out the chronobowls and the revisiting to the different time periods, etc. And the Jay Garrick character, the black and white Flash, and Andy's conceptualizing that he would like that as one of the characters and quite large on screen. And then DJ, our visual effects supervisor, said, well, if we're going to have a digital character that large on screen, then it would be better to have a real face just to help with the look of the shot. And so I stuck my hand up, my arm nearly flew off my shoulder to volunteer to have an opportunity to have my face stuck on the original Flash. And so there it is.
And now you two are part of the DC Extended Universe.
Yes, we both have our tables set up at future Comic-Cons. So if anyone would like to come along and have a autograph from the mad scientist.
Glossy 6x10s.
Paul, how much is an autograph from the editor of Baby Driver?
I don't know, 5-10 cents. I don't know. It's hard to say.
That's a bargain. With what limited time we have left, you both put so much into this film over such a long period of time. Obviously, those two scenes in particular, I would think would be my favorite if I were you. But for each of you, what was your favorite moment, scene, what have you, that you worked on in the film?
Oh, wow.
Okay, well, I'll volunteer. Fun enough, it's probably one of the more straight dialogue scenes. And I guess it's some of the footage with Keaton and Ezra in the cave, just having a discussion. I mean, for all the remarkable stuff we achieved on the film, sometimes it's the old-fashioned storytelling which is the best, and just having footage, the caliber of both those actors, of Michael and Ezra, and just being able to kind of construct that and go for the feels and things like that. Even though that's some of the simplest stuff done in the film for me, it's potentially some of the most enjoyable for me, just to be able to have the opportunity to have access to footage of actors like that and be able to construct a moment.
I guess my favorite points in the movie were Ezra's comical timings. He had lots of one-liners that I felt were hilarious. And Paul cut the scene of the flatsmate, and I thought that was hilarious. The guy on the couch with his...
Oh, Back to the Future.
That always made me laugh every time I watched it. I mean, I love the film in total. It's hard to have specific moments. What I can say is all the bad ones were dropped, though.
You guys both did a fantastic job. I appreciate it very much, especially recording this when we are early on a Sunday. And you've both done Australia proud. Good on you.
Hadn't quite thought it through in that way, but I guess that's very true.
Of course Australia's proud of them. Who wouldn't be? That was a huge movie they just pulled off. A great big supersonic, faster than the speed of light thank you to Paul and Jason for joining us today. Both guys are superheroes in my book, not to mention super busy. So I hope you enjoyed hearing from them. Of course, you can show your appreciation to those guys by getting out to the theater to see The Flash. You can also show your appreciation for this show by checking out the latest version of Avid Media Composer. So many fun and powerful features going into the legendary NLE all the time. And all you have to do to get up to speed on them is to click that link in the show notes, and it will take you right to the Media Composer page on avid.com. That could not be easier. And so worth your time. Speaking of time, it's up. Once again, we've come to the end of one of our little explorations into the cutting rooms of the best editors in the world. We should do it again, don't you think? I hope so. I'd feel foolish making these if you don't. Either way, until we do meet again, this is Matt Fury thanking you for joining me right here on The Rough Cut.